The psychic is strangely placed in the Lucio Fulci canon. He is surely most famous for two very different periods of work: his earlier Giallo films, as discussed in previous podcasts, and his surrealist and visceral horror that was yet to come. Whilst the psychic certainly fits into the latter category, his career was well past its Giallo heyday, and even the Giallo film itself was falling out of fashion. After Don't Torture a Duckling, Fulci had tried his hand at a number of different genres, most memorably, in my opinion, the spaghetti western, with Four of the Apocalypse. But here he was, back where he started, sort of. I am the Italian Horror Guy, and this is the Italian Horror Guy podcast. The psychic is slightly off kilter. It is so plot heavy in an arguably tedious way that it lacks much of the style we expect from the genre. But something else was also changing. The music sounds different. With the influence of Fabio Frizzi's dramatic low piano notes, the score is often reminiscent of The Beyond, or more reminiscent of The Beyond than it is of Fulci's earlier Giallo films. Furthermore, there are so many dramatic zooms into eyeballs that it could easily be mistaken for The House by the Cemetery. Of course, these are later Fulci works. There are still many elements of old Fulci at play. His use of an almost identical shot early in the film of an unfortunate soul sliding face first down a cliff is very clearly a visual reference to Don't Torture a Duckling. The procedural, detail-heavy investigations remind very much of Perversion Story and A Lizard in a Woman's Skin, Fulci films discussed in earlier podcasts. In short, this is Fulci in transition. Yes, there are many moments of violence and gore in his non-horror films between 1972 and 1979, but they belong to a different category entirely. The Psychic is Fulci moving on from the past to the future, a film that connects the two highly contrasting famous eras. It is important that we understand this largely ignored and forgotten film. The Psychic begins almost exactly where Duckling left off, with a girl, Virginia, played by Fausta Avelli, witnessing a relative plummet down the side of a cliff, having their face ripped to pieces in the process, as if she had not already had enough of this when Don Alberto died. In this case, it is Virginia's mother, but in vision form. She is a clairvoyant after all. Just like in Duckling, the camera zooms out from the dead body, and a pleasant tune plays for the audience to enjoy. Fulci certainly loved this technique. Upon first watch, this appears to be lacking in ideas or originality, but this turns out to be no cheap knockoff. If the Giallo is at least partly defined by confusing, unclear information, the Psychic adds a surrealist, dreamlike element into the mix. For me, the most memorable moment of the film is when adult Virginia has visions whilst driving through tunnels. She's driving through the country and moves through a short tunnel as some low, sinister-sounding music plays. This is interrupted when she leaves the tunnel and a DJ makes an announcement on her car radio. But she soon enters another tunnel and the music is back, deeper and more sinister than before. The process repeats, and then the third tunnel is longer before we finally zoom right into Virginia's eyes. She envisages a broken mirror, a man sitting in a yellow taxi, a light, multiple pictures, bricks being laid, with uninterrupted breathing being heard, a fancy house, and a bloodied, murdered person, and a mustachioed, sinister-looking man, amongst other things. The scene concludes to some pleasant sounding music. The same black notes from which the more tedious name for this film derives its title, that is, Murder to the Tune of 7 Black Notes. Given there is a black screen as these notes play, they create a gap between Virginia's vision and reality. She awakes, screaming from the dream, or as if from a dream, to a police officer checking on her welfare. Now, this is a fascinating scene. Firstly, we should note the quintessentially Giallo nature of it. Classic early Argento Giallo films, as will be discussed in the next few podcasts, or should I say in future podcasts, not far into the future, they are noted for their ambiguous, unclear details early on in the film. I'll clarify, actually, they were discussed in previous podcasts. My apologies. These drive the plot, always with the knowledge that piecing the details together will solve the mystery. In that sense, it is almost a love letter to the Giallo itself, but more is going on here. With the theme of clairvoyance, Fulci is moving closer towards the supernatural. There was something coldly scientific about Perversion Story and Lizard, films in which the absurd could always be explained by something more logical. Virginia soon finds herself in a villa owned by her husband Francesco, scoping out renovation ideas. She sees multiple items from her earlier vision, and we hear harsh music as the camera repeatedly zooms dramatically into her eyes. The visions possess Virginia to hack through the wall with a pickaxe, likely inspired by Marcus Daly in Deep Red, Argento's 1975 classic, a scene to be discussed, or that has already been discussed at great length in previous podcasts. As she makes her way through the wall, the bricklaying vision appears again. Virginia soon notices rotten fingers in the wall. She has discovered a secret. Is this house haunted? A local nervous man explains to the police that he knew they were here. Sure, the spirits. We hear them. This is not a theme overly developed from this point on, but I think it is important to note. This evokes the supernatural adjacent haunted house motif. And when combined with the clairvoyance, Fulci is building a non-traditional Giallo. This is, however, a very Fulcian Giallo. It is still very much a Giallo indeed. This is still very much a Fulci Giallo. Whilst often considered a maestro of gore, rightly so, Fulci's other types of excess are less vaunted, but there is a particular kind of excess he specialized in, that of the very long scene of the main female protagonist being chased and ultimately surviving. Virginia's investigations, guided by her visions, lead her to a large fancy house. A dramatic, piano-heavy score is playing as she recognizes images from her visions. The music and the presentation of interesting information let us know not to expect a sudden jump scare. This is the slow building of tension. A gloved hand suddenly turns off the music, letting us know Virginia can hear it as well. We now realize we hear what she hears and feel a greater part of the scene. Virginia turns around and moves towards a staircase, noticing blood dripping on the stairs and then a recently murdered old woman she recognizes from a previous vision. She screams, does Virginia. The gloved figure hears her, and a different, now non-diegetic score begins. It has the pacing of a metronome, but also a distant echoing background effect. Again, something bad will happen, but not just yet. This is what Fulci does to his female characters from time to time. We might remember back to A Lizard in a Woman's Skin, in which Carol is chased for minutes on end in movie time by the redhead. This is a different kind of murderer-victim structure to the traditional Giallo. In the case of Lizard, in fact, Carol was certainly no victim in the grander context of the film. But here in The Psychic, Virginia is a victim, yes, but has a privileged amount of autonomy. She can see the future, after all. A man from an earlier vision appears exactly as Virginia had seen him, mustachioed and wandering down the stairs inquisitively. Virginia stays out of sight as the man searches. The music continues to inquire. She enters a fancy room and notices a porcelain head, also from her vision. The camera again zooms in on her eyes quite excessively. Details are important, and those fast zooms are being well and truly ensconced into the Fulci oeuvre. The music becomes more frantic and the tension starts to build. Virginia, however, feels safe. She has locked herself in the room, but she has become complacent in her agency. She knocks over a picture. The payoff comes. The man hears. He tries to break into the locked room, and now we get some Fulci excess. This sets the scene for a long, drawn-out chase scene. This seems to be a key Fulci method for building compassion: length. Given so many associate Fulci with gore and excess, it would be easy to think the only payoff was the death or the method of murder. This was almost certainly the case in his Zombie and Gates of Hell films, to be discussed in future podcasts. But in his Giallo, this is not so much the case. In Don't Torture a Duckling, Machara's murder is drawn out for a reason. This was designed to be as upsetting as possible. In Fulci's long scenes of death and potential death, he makes sure we feel the fear. By experiencing these moments seemingly in real time, we experience all the uncertainty and fear Fulci can possibly force us to. Virginia escapes the house and runs to another place of fear, her husband's villa, where she initially found the body. As she approaches, we can hear very deep piano notes. She goes inside and the music stops entirely. She wanders into a church-like setting, then up a winding staircase as we hear the man trying to break in. The inquisitive music is back again, but this time faster. She is up on a balcony, peering out as the man enters the area. The music is silent. The man looks around slowly and eventually begins to leave. But then, just like in Lizard, a noise alerts the would-be killer to her location. This time, it is the 7 black notes of her wristwatch. She scrambles to hide the noise, but of course, it is too late. The man has noticed. Virginia looks for and finds higher ground, and the man chases her. She eventually finds herself cornered on a platform. Only a wooden plank separates her from the man. We hear a non-diegetic, loud and intense version of the 7 black notes. The climax is finally here. The man falls through the plank and lies motionless on the floor, almost dead. Virginia whimpers and leaves. This is a long scene. It is an emotional roller coaster. Virginia almost gets caught a number of times and she is unambiguously who we are rooting for. This scene, along with other similar ones in Fulci's Giallo, stands out because spectacles of female victimhood in the genre are almost always spectacles of death. But death is not the conclusion here. So what does it mean? Well, it means the gorehound notion is too simplistic. If Fulci earned that status, which he did, it was unfair to label him as only a gorehound. There is a depth of fear, the empathy that Fulci creates in these scenes that is rare in the Giallo. We actually care about Virginia. She's not just some beautiful woman we know will be butchered. We fear for her. We care about her. Fulci has proven once and for all that he has emotional depth, or at least that his films did. The last scene reminds again of Perversion Story, given that the main character does not appear in it and her fate is initially unclear, removing her agency. After Francesco, the actual killer, has trapped her behind a newly minted wall. Her friend Luca has brought two police officers there, insisting she is in danger. Francesco feigns innocence, of course, and willingly lets them in. I don't know where she could be. I've looked everywhere, he says. Luca stares him down and looks around the room intently. After a tedious conversation and some stern faces, Luca gives up rather willingly. As the police usher him away, Virginia, it seems, is doomed. But as they leave, the 7 black notes play. Luca and Francesco look at each other knowingly, and presumably, Virginia is saved. Presumably, because the film ends here rather abruptly. This ending is almost perfect for the Fulci Giallo era because it highlights the lack of genuine agency his protagonists hold. Whether it be George du Maurier, Carol Hammond, or Virginia, there is always a sense that their fate is out of their hands. As such, I think this film is the perfect way for Fulci to have signed off on this part of his career. If the Giallo can be partly defined as a world of depravity in which no one is really in control of their own destiny, the psychic hits the mark perfectly. Even a psychic is unable to control her destiny. Thoughtful, procedural, and convoluted is the Fulci Giallo film. But Fulci did lean into the fantastical ever so slightly in this film, The Psychic. That, along with a slightly more dramatic editing style, built a foundation for the extraordinary shift Fulci's career soon took. That shift will be discussed in future podcasts, most likely starting next month with Zombie Flesh Eaters. And I look forward to bringing those too. So, as that was a significantly shorter script than previous podcasts, I thought I would just take maybe 10 or 15 minutes to, have a little bit of a less formal discussion. I had limited scenes from that film, and I believe, I'm sure I've mentioned in previous podcasts that I am putting a book together. And at this stage, what I've just done, or what I've just read out there, will be chapter 3 of the book. And each podcast in recent months has aligned with a chapter, although clearly out of order, because I believe this is the 6th such episode that I've done. And my thinking and how the book is being structured at the moment is in 4 sections. The first section being what just concluded then, Fulci's 1970s Giallo films. And part of the reason that I made that one a little bit shorter was that the previous chapter on Don't Torture a Duckling was very, very long, and I don't want to bore the readers. I think what I'm really enjoying about putting this book together, and I've got a sort of loose plan, but I'm really enjoying exploring what I really understand and believe about these films, and I think they unfold not so much in a collective narrative exactly. That would be far too ambitious a concept to bring together, but nonetheless, you see the evolution of Fulci's work, and indeed Argento's work. I love the contrast between their early 70s films, where you can when you watch Argento's animal trilogy films, I think you just think this is Giallo, right? However it is that we define the concept, this is very much it. And I think A Lizard in a Woman's Skin and Perversion Story, you don't necessarily think that. Certainly not with Perversion Story, and I think it is important to note that we can get a little bit, I suppose, obsessive when it comes to categorizing things. However, I do think there's something in, you know, understanding what a genre is and why it sort of appeals to us. And look, maybe some people do just like Fulci's work because he he certainly created some serious spectacles of violence, many of which are lacking from the psychic. But I would like to give myself a bit more credit than that. But I think I would like to give the vast majority of Fulci and even perhaps Giallo and even later Italian horror movie viewers credit. Like, there's something more to it. I think if it's as simple as I enjoy watching depictions of people get butchered or, eaten or whatever it might be, then maybe you are just a sort of mindless gorehound. But what is it that fascinates us about this, right? Because, um, you know, just thinking about the psychic, which is or Murder to the Tune of Seven Black Notes. As some people might know it more commonly, or Sette Notte in Nero, or I think it's I think that's what it's called, the Italian version. But um, you should all check it out. Um, it's not particularly well known, but and it's certainly not one of my favorite of his films. But there's like there's a richness in the way that he could explore characters, and I think as a general rule, this is probably true of the Giallo, but certainly of a lot of Fulci's works. As they went along, especially, you can get these really sort of small casts, and we can get to know people and characters very, very quickly. And it would be easy to look at this film or go back to Don't Torture a Duckling and consider the way Machara gets um, tortured to death, and the way Virginia just gets very, very steadily, like it's a pretty traumatic movie from start to end for Virginia. And as much as the ending implies that she's safe, I guess we don't know entirely. But it's things stick with you when you've built something like a genuine care and rapport with characters. And you know um, whilst one would say that the torture in Don't Torture a Duckling is excessive, I mean, that's the point, right? Like, I think a lot of horror movies sort of, get off on like really just giving you this uncomfortable spectacle. But for the most part, they're sort of mindless hack characters that we don't actually care about, and it's more like a challenge of how we can understand. Sorry, how we can see this. But the defiling of the human body is there's a sort of separation in it when we watch those films, beyond even the fact that we're watching a film, in that often these characters are just mindless pieces of meat. So seeing them turned into meat isn't any particular disappointment to us. It might be uncomfortable to watch, but I think the way that Fulci is able to build that sense of rapport with characters is quite extraordinary. And I guess the sort of hilarious thing is, and this is why I broke the book. I am breaking the book into these different sections, is because I think there's quite a tangible. I like the idea of grouping things together where I can, without trying to be obsessive about it. And I think the psychic belongs with those two aforementioned Fulci Gialli. It's such an unbelievably tangible difference when he comes out the other side of it with Zombie, and then he suddenly produced a whole bunch of horror movies that were completely fantastical in nature, right? And why I think it's good, and I think it's convenient for my book that this happens, is because Argento sort of switched at a very similar time as well. So in the case of Argento, I did 2 chapters on his first the Animal trilogy movies, and then then a chapter on Deep Red. And the thing with Deep Red is that it's very much a giallo, but it's got fantastical elements. Maybe a lot of the stuff that happens in it is unrealistic, but it's not technically scientifically impossible. So there's more going on there, and you can see Argento moving away, and it's this perfect mixture of. It's like you look at all three of his Animal trilogy films, and you think, yeah, that's a giallo film, right? They're giallo films, and as much as in a way, in my opinion, let's let's call let's call Deep Red the king of the giallo and the bird with the crystal plumage, the godfather of it. Because I think the bird with the crystal, I suspect that the giallo as a successful continual genre doesn't happen without the bird with the crystal plumage. Whereas it is the king with Deep Red because it is simply the best of them. And yet you can see a real evolution towards, or the beginning of the evolution towards something more fantastical, something more exploratory, if that's the right word, if it even is a word. Because obviously by the time Suspiria came out, which is also structured very much like a giallo, but you would probably just put it in the more fantastical horror category because it's sort of, it's about witches. You can see that he's gone from this really effective, tight procedural structure, very interesting, very almost poetic, his Animal trilogy, and then he's taken elements of that, and then he's combined that with the exploration of fantasy and that kind of thing in Deep Red, and it's this perfect mix, and it's ponderous, and I love that it's really long, and I despise the fact. Well, I don't despise the fact, but it sort of disappoints me a little bit. I suppose that there's a quite readily commercially available shorter version because a big part of the brilliance of that film is its ponderousness. But so anyway, it is to me quite a tangible section is the of their careers is the Fulci Giallo in the 70s, early 70s to late-ish 70s, and the early to mid-70s Giallo of the of Argento. In Fulci's case, it's such a tangible shift, and I think it happened because Fulci was always trying to be a gun for hire. And I just want to be clear before anyone's jumping up in arms. Yes, I understand that he made a lot of different genres, and me sort of going on about films like his Giallo films that made him semi-famous, but not as famous as Zombie and all that. Like I get it, but I just want to be clear that the purpose of this book is the things that I can technically categorize in the broad horror genre, and I don't think Contraband and those mid to late 70s films they're obviously not in that category, but I acknowledge that I'm missing some, but I've got a broad categorization. But let's call the Giallo ones the Giallo section, and then the next one's his horror section, very broadly. So I'm doing a chapter on Zombie Flesh Eaters, I'm doing a chapter on Gates of Hell, and then I'm doing a chapter on the New York Ripper, which is obviously not in the fantastical nature, or doesn't have those fantastical elements as much. But I think we're very much in the gun for hire era, and to me, again, not wanting to overdo the categorizations, that's now an imitation of a slasher. And to me, that's a fascinating concept because it's in a way it's come full circle. The slasher was very, very much inspired by / copied from the Giallo, and the success in the early to mid 70s, and then it was taken up in the late 70s, early 80s in the slasher form in America. And then when Fulci's trying to expand his popularity or continue his popularity, he goes to what feels very much like a slasher film, even the music and that kind of thing. But I think the slasher film is quite readily thought of in the horror genre, more so than the Giallo, even though they should probably both belong in there quite readily. And in the second section of Argento, it's fantasy. So I think I'll likely include a little bit of discussion around the Inferno in the Suspiria chapter. Not guaranteed, but likely. And then when he comes out of it into a different place, it's going to be more the sort of let's call it the more artsy, or more not artsy, the more visceral section of Argento's career, because as I'm sure I will discuss in when I get to writing them, whilst Argento does a lot of great work in the late 70s and early to mid 80s, he's on the journey towards, I guess, believing his own press. That the thing, and this is such a fascinating thing that I love about Argento's. It's almost contradictory in a way. He was not that good with his scripts, and he was unbelievably good with his style, like historically great with his style. But because he believed in his scripts, even though they were often simplistic and silly and often basically the same story, because he really cared about those scripts, he worked really hard on them, and they at least were a very important guiding force of how he made a good film. Eventually, and you can see it in his interviews and stuff, he starts talking a lot about, not worrying so much about scripts and really focusing on style. And I think that was a massive mistake, because it was like until Deep Red, it was as if he cared so much about his scripts and his characters that they needed to be stylistic in order to. It was a means of bringing out the stories that he cared about. Once he stopped caring about his stories and he just went pure style, I think he got a little bit pretentious. And as great as Suspiria is, and it is great, it's sort of the bridge to that next stage. But, of course, Tenebrae is a great film. Phenomena is interesting. And at this stage, I think I'll be doing a chapter which will likely be chapter 11 on Tenebrae, and then maybe a chapter that combines Phenomena and opera. And opera being, I think, the sort of the end of Argento as we know him or knew him. But I've got a previous podcast on that you should all check out. Nonetheless, I hope that I haven't rambled too much. If you want to hear me rambling more, you can listen to previous podcasts and the Horror Film Science podcast, of which I believe there are currently 41 episodes available. Nonetheless, I hope you have enjoyed listening to this episode. Join me again next month. As always, I am the I'll do that again. I am the Italian Horror Guy, and this has been the Italian Horror Guy podcast.